Meeting is being recorded.
Oh, they tell you now. Presenter, right?
Yeah, see how that goes.
Yeah.
So Nadia, maybe you could give a little bit of an extended bio before get into your topic. A little bit more than you did yesterday.
Sure. I'm gonna look on the custom using showing this.
I imagine that if I do like that.
Yep.
it'll
Yeah, but
just
I'm
go.
not showing the German.
It's not. See it, Jeremy?
I can, but I can't tell yet whether it will work once you start to move the slides.
Weird. All right.
Just
well,
move the slides and tell her now.
Yeah, or tell me, try to move the slides. No, so I can't see the change. I think if you just switch it so I see presenter mode, that works usually, if you can do that.
I think, hang on just a sec. I think we should. Stop the share just for a second. See, this is, I don't find that.
Father Roger, you did it yesterday somehow.
This is double?
Okay.
Okay. So now.
It's crazy.
Let me, like, get to that.
That's bad.
Maybe this shouldn't be doubled.
Last day,
Does that make sense?
What do you mean?
If this is just mirroring the screen. Yep, right?
Yeah, but we're not even using that. We're using a Zoom.
Yeah, yes, I understand. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the AirPlay. Let's try this. If we go to the PowerPoint, cast it to one or the other. Yeah, get this.
So we're not sharing it in the Zoom yet.
I know that. I'm trying to see if I can split them, and then because sometimes it works better if you're on two different displays and you share the one where it's open. On that, because that's what we did with the training. We'll try this for like one more minute and then just give up. So if that.
What's the paragraph saying?
Have you ever been in Spain?
I was in Madrid once in 2018.
This way.
Or actually, no, not
I'm
just like
looking forward
3
to
days. It was
everything
like,
kind of soon.
yeah, like,
It-
where are you from?
Nice to meet you.
City, which is
This is
like
in
3 hours.
So
Okay.
yesterday, the way it was
Where'd you go?
working,
Now I'm doing the
What I'd like
PhD
to
in
do is to
Madrid.
get this
Oh,
a little
okay.
smaller so it comes together.
Where did you go before?
So to the University of Valencia,
Okay.
I moved to Valencia to
So
do the
we have to share
bachelor,
it first.
and now I'm doing the PhD in Madrid in a Jesuit university.
You're gonna be a doctor.
But
You're gonna be a doctor.
I'm gonna be
I
there.
think I would
Wow.
know that. I
Hopefully,
know that, right?
hopefully in summer.
The only way I'm getting there is an honorary doctorate. And I'm definitely putting it on my passport.
Wait, how old are you,
So
Diego?
you should be getting screen sharing
25,
now.
25.
okay, can you try to move the slides for me?
Yeah, I know.
The open station here.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
I know some
Pretty good one.
Yeah,
Can you try to move a slide for me?
priest I know in the States.
Do you
went-
see that?
I think he went there for medical.
No, can you try to, now that you're sharing with
Yeah.
me, it's
No,
maybe,
See,
yes, that's good, that'll work.
Yeah.
We're set.
It's a good one.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Which is-
It's
I don't
probably good.
understand what happened. Did it work?
It works.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Diego, are you at the University of Valencia? Or are
I
you?
studied the bachelor, yeah.
Is that a Catholic school?
No.
All right, well,
Now I mean.
you'd think after all this time on Zoom, everything, that it would be easier than that. It worked completely differently from when I was running trainings last fall. for my previous organization. Okay, so my name is Nadia Wolf, as you all know from yesterday and also the day before. The J's in my name is just to throw you off. You can pronounce it however, I'll respond. So I'm an attorney by training. I don't practice law. I'm licensed, but you don't really want me like taking anybody to court, writing your will. Theoretically, it's possible. It would be a bad call. Because at law school, I took as many international law courses as possible. You don't really specialize in American law schools, but it's kind of what the what electives you take make a difference there. So I graduated in 2014 from William and Mary. Prior to that, I was like an ESL teacher in Moscow, and I studied Russian studies and theater with a minor in poverty, besides like just the general student poverty experience at Washington and Lee. So as you already know the most important thing, which is that the Red Sox are the best. This is now a Red Sox room. There's like one outpost of Yankee Dome like right above us, which is Monsignor Franco's office. But that's it. So yeah, so we were having some conversations about expanding some of the training, and this is my topic, which is nice because I've given similar training. So congrats, you're not total guinea pigs, but you might be slightly guinea pigs because I haven't made it a PowerPoint in the past. So basically, the idea of this is to give you kind of an understanding, not of necessarily specific human rights provisions. I'm not going to get into all of the treaties. That information is available, but to give you kind of an understanding of how we should be understanding human rights, particularly from a Catholic perspective. But also kind of as we're looking at situations in the UN, there's a lot of claims about, oh, this is a human right, this is violating human rights. Well, how do we actually assess that? We should be testing it really against the human person themselves. So that's the first point. Hopefully the slide has changed out in Colorado or something. So this is just what we're going to talk about here. First, the centrality of the person. Secondly, kind of the formation, but then also the fragmentation of kind of the modern human rights regime, I would say, or law, and kind of the post-war era. That's the Second World War, in case anybody's confused about which war. And then also, what are the effects of that? And then just a little bit about kind of how we're treating it. And I thought this would be useful to like have my notes, and actually, it's just not going to be. So, all right. So first of all, when we talk about law, we really have to think about the person. Okay. So I have a question for all of you. What's the purpose of law? And this is not like a graded answer. What do you think? Why do we have laws? What's their purpose? This is interactive, so yeah.
To set parameters in society so that it can function efficiently.
Okay, so efficient functioning of society. When you have kind of set rules, you actually have a shared expectation or understanding of how certain things work, right? Like I always use the example of like traffic laws. If the red light doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, we've got a real problem, right? You have certain expectations of that. What else might be the purpose of law?
To realize justice.
Okay, how do we know what justice is? You don't have to answer that, but that's if we think we have to have an idea of what justice is if we're going to talk about realizing it, right? So that's it's a good one, but then the question is, what is justice? And so we have to kind of look a little bit deeper. Okay, any other? Yeah.
I guess kind of combining those two answers, you could say the purpose of law ultimately is to bring us into right relationship with God. Like from like a very broad view, like even traffic laws are like one of the 4 sources of law, basically. Like,
Are 4 sources of law?
I think
You got
isn't there
sources?
like divine law, human law, natural law, and eternal law.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Divine will
Okay.
Gotcha. Well, I hope that all of our laws bring us closer to God. That certainly think orderly and regulated behavior can contribute to that. But I'm thinking about law in our human context, not necessarily in a religious one, although it's not opposed with it. There's a lot of different theories about why we have laws, right? Or law itself. The most basic one, see, we're all in an advanced society. We've now had centuries of development, millennia of development. Back in the day, might makes right. So what do you need law for? Basically, if you have a system where anybody can just overpower somebody else, and then you end up in these kind of clan wars, right? You get the Code of Hammurabi, some level of proportionality that prohibits the free use of violence, right? So that's kind of your most basic look at what law could be. Then you could get into, orderly society, right? Kind of creating that. And that's kind of getting closer to what we're thinking about, because it talks about really ordering relationships between members of the society, right? There is a relationship between drivers on the road, even if it's not a personal one, but there's some sort of expectation there. And that's kind of getting closer. Another thing you could talk about, some theorists might say, it's about basically the legitimacy of the rules themselves. So we have some sort of agreement over, these that we've selected, our rulers, and that the rules that come out of that are legitimate, and that kind of, and that sort of democratic legitimacy, in a sense, is the purpose of law, so that we're self-governing, in essence, right? But for our purposes, we're going to look really at the idea that law is about the person themselves, and that gets closer to your idea. So you're kind of jumping to a deeper sense of it. But the other question that I'm really going to pose for you, that we're going to think about as we go through it, right, is what happens when the law isn't grounded in the human person? Okay. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit more as we go through. So first thing is, international law was generally known as the law of nations in the past. Now this is an English thing. I don't know how it goes in other languages. And now we've got human rights law, okay? So in a traditional sense, right, law of nations, it's about the countries. It's regulating, relations between the countries themselves. There's no kind of individual international law. You're not really a subject of it. So nations, or in prior eras, the rulers themselves, we still operate a little bit like that here, since as the Holy See, we're kind of a unique situation. But it's not really touching in people, right? So it can be very easy for us. We have all of this rights language. And of course, you have rights in a national context, guarantees in your constitutional system, or whatever that is. But in an international sense, it was all between countries. That's why you've got things like Court of Justice, International Court of Arbitration is quite old. Those things were typically taking up issues from the countries themselves. So even if there's a maritime dispute, if you want that resolved, your country has to take it up with the country on the other side of it. It's not really addressing individuals at that level. But today, right, now we've got this human beings as rights holders in this international context, right? And this, of course, happens because we have a unique combination of terrible offenses within one nation, that nation taking over other nations and then doing the same terrible things there, right? And just a total shock to the conscience of the world itself. So, so we have to think about really, like, how did we get to this point where for so long, in essence, there is no real individual person there. You might have occasionally, okay, the Prince of Prussia takes things up on behalf of the Volga Germans in Russia or something, kind of defending their rights to a certain extent, or advocating for them with whoever's in charge of the land they're in, but we're not really addressing them as individuals who have inalienable rights in that particular, in an international legal sense, right? They might have rights in there. So how did we get there? There's a lot more to how we got there than what I will address in particular. I'm just going to bring up basically one kind of great Catholic historical example. This is not the only person who contributed to that. This is a survey version, so don't take this as the end all be all. But you might have heard of Bartolomé de las Casas. Okay, I see heads nodding. Tell me what you know.
So he was in the discovery of America, and he was like advocating for the rights of the Indians. So because there were abuses from the Spanish and the Portuguese.
Yes, and he was Spanish himself, right? So actually he first went as a colonist, right, to the New World, went back to Spain, became a priest. I think he was Dominican, which, this would bear me out in the painting. So went back to Spain, became a priest, returned to the New World, did not have like an immediate change of heart over these issues. But at a certain point, it really kind of clicked for him that the indigenous people who were being enslaved, who were being terribly mistreated, were humans equal to us, right? So he benefited from that abuse, but then he had this profound conversion to the point where everybody who came to him for confession who owned slaves was told, like, and your penance is to free your slaves, which is, I think, great. But it resulted in some of his things, it resulted in some struggles for him. He ended up actually going back to Spain and having debates over the treatment of the indigenous peoples. Sadly, we know that we didn't have some like massive, change in how everybody was treated in the Americas. But he really became a champion of the dignity and rights of the native peoples, okay? And that's important to go from, like, the idea of human dignity is not, new in the 16th century, even if it's not necessarily described in that way. But the application of rights is kind of unique, right? So he takes these ideas from natural law, right, about the value of the person, and then he's expressing it in rights. So what's our basis for that? First of all, we're all humans, right? So, he said something like, they are our brothers, Christ died for them, just like for us, right? So it's not the common humanity of all people is kind of is the basis for this. He also had this idea, we're talking about freedom, not just in terms of what you can do, but also in a sense of solidarity. We have reciprocal rights and duties. Okay? So it's not just, I can do what I want. It's not just freedom from restraint. It's also about thinking about how to do things, how to do right. So this is getting to our right relationship with God. So a couple of questions for us to think about, right? In light of what you said, oh, this is coming out differently than I thought. Well, that was weird. It's showing up on the preview, but not in here. So the question at the top is, why do we have human rights? Okay. So I've given you the basics. You can figure it out. So why do we have them? Why do we have human rights?
Protect the dignity of the person.
Okay.
To avoid what happened during the Second World War.
We hope so. Yeah, absolutely.
To protect the weak who can't defend their own rights themselves.
Yeah. Okay.
And to orientate national laws, because human rights could not be enforced, but the national legislation could work in the
Yeah.
in the way.
That's actually a really important point that I don't have touched on in here, but yeah, human rights law is a section of international law, okay? So it comes up under the same sorts of things as other international law, treaty, custom, as our sources, but you can't really, it really depends on national ownership to ensure that it's protected, right? So when countries sign treaties, they're saying we're going to implement this here. The treaty itself is generally not going to make like justice happen on the ground, right? That actually has to be, you have to have just institutions, you have to have people involved, things like that, yeah. And why do people have human rights? Why do we say that we all have them? This is like too easy for you at this point because we just had Las Casas on the screen. Yeah.
But it's easy from a Catholic perspective.
Mhm.
But if you are looking for the non-Catholic perspective, I don't know.
Because all people are equals.
Yeah, because we're equal in our humanity, even if we're not, we're not all, look, I'm the slowest runner in this room, I guarantee it. We're not all equally gifted in every area. We're not all born into the same situations, but we're all equally human, right? So that's really getting at our human dignity, right? We have these rights just because we're human, okay? So what are the characteristics of that? That leads us to a couple of other conclusions, right? If we're all human, then that's a characteristic that's inherent and fundamental in us. So you can't really take that away from somebody, right? You can violate dignity, you can mistreat somebody, you can abuse them, but it doesn't change their fundamental value, right? And that value is universal to everybody. Okay? We hear these kind of lists, indivisible, interdependent, interrelated. You might hear that in some of the UN context. but really, we can't lose this dignity no matter what we do, no matter our circumstances, and everybody has it, okay? So when we think about the human person, right, I want you to think about law as existing for the sake of the person, right? So getting towards your point, and it requires, you know, prohibition on the free use of violence and orderly regulation, you know, reliability there. But the reason that it's important in the human rights context in particular is because when you don't have a law that's grounded in the person, who is a person is up for debate, okay? So that's, if we're not taking into account, you know, the person, that we have laws that just don't respond to what our actual needs are, when we're talking about, you know, the reality of the person themselves, you know, do we recognize the capacity for reason? Do we recognize that we're relational beings? But also, you know, think about every human rights abuse that you can think of in history, right? And we don't need to have had the human rights regime to know that mistreating indigenous people is deeply wrong, okay? But what do all those things rely on, right?
Dehumanizing their victims.
Exactly, you know. So, you know, can give all sorts of historical examples of terribly racist characterizations of indigenous people, of people from Africa. Even, of course, much closer, where we've got terrible characterizations of Jews in the Second World War, or if you study the Rwandan genocide, you know, Tutsis are cockroaches was something that was repeated across the radio. All of these things really depend on dehumanizing. And we see that also in areas that I encounter a lot, which is abortion, where, you know, it's a fetus, it's products of conception, it's just a bit of tissue, where all those things basically turn who gets to count into how we define who the person is, without necessarily caring about, okay, but are they a living human being, right? Are they a member of our species? Well, they're not really a person under the law because they're indigenous or they're Black and they can't really think like us, or they're, you know, not really capable of that. This is telling me something about PowerPoint not responding, but I don't know. I mean, I can go off notes. I'm just going to keep going because, you know, hopefully you're still interested. And if you're not, you've got like another hour of me. So that's too bad for you. So, all right. I actually had a really cool, we used the background, a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt with the UDHR. So hopefully we'll get to that soon. But then the next section is really about this kind of modern human rights regime and its formation. Okay. So what can you tell me about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? I know some of you at least have heard of it. Okay. I think probably most of you or all of you have heard of it. What do you know about it?
It was in 1938.
I think you probably mean 48?
Yeah, 48.
Oh, I'm sorry, I heard 30. Yes.
No, 50. After the war.
Okay, yeah, so exactly. So 10th of December, 1948, that's now Human Rights Day, so you can celebrate. You know, any excuse for cake, it's a good one. It has 30 articles. You guys are gonna get your UN passes today, right? Okay, well, if you go up to the third floor near the Security Council chamber, there's actually a really nice display where there's kind of illustrations of each of the 30 articles, okay? And it's grounded, we have it right in the preamble as well as in the first declaration. It's really grounded in human dignity, which I think you were getting to the problem of where does that come from. They just kind of assert it and they don't say where, okay? So that's interesting. Certainly, I think religion has an easier time of answering that question than non-religion, although it can be done. But also freedom. And again, not just freedom from, but solidarity, right? We're not just individual atomized people who can kind of make our own choices and how dare you restrain me, right? We're part of communities, we're relational beings. So in the first article, it says, right, we had all those ideas. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, so dignity first. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Okay, so we should really think about this, right? Why are we equal, right? This is kind of the fundamental question, right? We have to be thinking about that. Where does it come from? Where does that dignity come from? Well, we're a unity of kind of a body and rational capacities that act in relationship with others, right? We don't necessarily have to have all of those things right at that moment. I don't think if we're counting on like the toddler crowd to be rational, we're gonna be disappointed. I say as an aunt of 12 people. But it's still, the capacity is there, right? The inherent characteristics of us as human beings are there in every member of our species, even when we're just one cell, right? And no matter your color, no matter your background, where you came from, etc., all of that's there. So around this time, I'm guessing definitely some people here have heard of Jacques Maritain. Yes, I see some nods. It's okay if you haven't, it's fine. He was part of the UNESCO, so UNESCO, the United Nations kind of educational, scientific, and cultural organization. Yeah, great. Look at that.
This is where we are.
Yeah, well, next one. Well, they could enjoy the slide really briefly. That's my, Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the committee that drafted the UDHR. Her vice chair was Charles Malik, a great Catholic thinker and law professor from Lebanon. And they almost immediately had profound disagreements. Not her and him in particular, but in the group, okay? And that is because of what Maritain wrote in his own assessment from all the philosophers who kind of offered different perspectives, looking at what rights should be there to kind of assist the committee. They said, we agree about the rights, but on the condition that you don't ask us why we have those rights. Okay. So that's really the fundamental, that's really the question. So we have kind of two main camps here. I'm going to just warn you that, again, this is a kind of a broad overview. You have kind of the natural law camp. Rights come from God or nature if you're not religious, right? And you kind of have that first before you have any sort of state. Or you have more of the, like the state grants people rights, okay? And that kind of broadly lines up with the more Marxist side of things, but that's not necessarily what every country or philosophy espousing those views had, okay? So at its core, you have basically a really fundamental difference about who the human person is. And if you have that fundamental difference about who the human person is, you can get to this practical agreement, but we are kind of sowing the seeds of some problems right there. Okay, so when we look at the why of these, make sure, why do we have human rights? Well, Las Casas gives us an answer that I think is still good today, right? Echoing what we've already discussed. All the races of the world are man, so we're all, the same species, which shouldn't be a question, but for some reason, for some people it was. All of men and each individual, there's but one definition, and that is that they are rational. So this differentiates us from other creatures. Okay, I know that the dolphins are really good at like spotting the different colors or something, but not the same. They're not leading campaigns for our behalf. All have understanding and will and free choice, and all are made in the image and likeness of God. So I think up until this last clause, which of course we know is true, you actually have something that's pretty accessible to a lot of people. Okay. What are we? We are rational beings. We're capable of making choices. It's not just about our appetites, right? We can think long term. We can set goals. We can sacrifice for something greater than ourselves. All of that stuff. So the key points here to take away, right? The centrality of the person. Okay. human beings can use reason, we're relational, and our understanding of freedom and solidarity, we have to understand these things kind of together, right? And that's something that's actually really beautiful in the UDHR. If you look at the rights, they are some of those freedom from restraint, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all those kind of basic civil rights. Those were later codified in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But you also have some things that go into more that kind of economic, social, and cultural area, right, where we're talking about just work conditions and things like that, okay? So it's not just freedom from restraint, but also freedom to do good and really creating conditions in which human beings can thrive. So this is not necessarily a shared understanding, but this is a good one for us to have. Okay. So, but what happens, right? When you have the same goal, right? We want human rights. We want to realize these human rights, but we don't have the same understanding of where those come from. What's going to happen? What do you think?
Then don't end up at the same place.
It's going to be tough, right? Yeah, because you've got kind of different ideas of what the path is to get there. Do you want to say something?
Some of those rights will come into conflict, and if you don't agree on the source, you're not going to agree on which one would trump the other.
Yeah, I mean, there are conflict of rights is like a whole area of law at all sorts of levels, right? How do you kind of balance when there's two valid competing interests? Absolutely true. And also, you know, should we be understanding these things in competition with each other? I think that's part of the problem that we'll talk about. The other thing is we have to think about the relationship of the person to the state. Okay, if we set ourselves in the mind of, I guess it was Stalin at the time. I say that like I don't know. It's definitely Stalin in 1948. You know, the idea in the USSR is really that the state is taking care of people and it comes first, right? So all of your rights, all of your obligations, these are all kind of coming from the state. You don't have things outside of that, right? But of course, from our perspective, the person comes first, right? And then the state should be serving the good of the person, which is, I don't want to get too deep into the different ideas there, but it really is, you know, it really is just, are there prior rights that people have because of our dignity that the state has an obligation to respect no matter what, right? And that's really the idea behind human rights entirely. Or is it somewhat subservient to what the state decides is good for people in that sense? So what happens almost immediately is that the whole thing gets politicized in the Cold War, right? 1948, we're also getting like the Berlin airlift, the Iron Curtain falls, everything. And this is not just in one direction. It's not just, oh, those communists, you know, taking things over or something. Part of what happens is that you get actually in the kind of more natural law camp, you end up with a pretty myopic focus on the individual rights holder, right? So you get all of those civil and political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of, you know, all those kind of freedom from restraint areas, which are important. I'm not undermining those at all, but those kind of capture the idea of the human rights field as a whole. And you kind of end up losing out a little bit on that idea of community solidarity, reciprocity. Okay, so nobody in this side is going to think that that these things don't matter, but they're focused so exclusively, right? Okay, you know, those communists, they oppress everybody. They don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of assembly or the press or what have you. You know, this is what freedom is, and it's really just this freedom from restraint and really thinking about people as individual rights holders only. And also what happens is that you lose this sense of interdependence and interrelation, not just between people and peoples of the world, but also the rights. So, you know, we're the ICCPR people, the civil and political rights people, and then, you know, that's they're in the economic, social, and cultural rights crowd, and we all know which one is more important, right? Whatever side you're on, those are the ones that really matter. But that's not what the UDHR reflected, and that's not what I think our faith reflects as Catholics. You have to really have both in that sense. So what happens as a result of this? Deconstruction derby is a term blatantly stolen from Marianne Glendon, who's a professor at Harvard, and could do much, is the source for quite a bit of this, right? First of all, you end up with kind of a situation of rights capture, okay? So now that we're not understanding them as a holistic set of what reflects the nature of the person themselves, what's good for the person, you have kind of special interest groups. It's not telling me anything about this one, but let me see.
There you go.
Ah, sweet. Okay, great. Well, we'll see now. It's going to like go a lot. There we go. We'll just leave it like that. Okay. So you have kind of this capture, right? We, you have this kind of capture of what human rights is, and it's very individualized view. So as a result of that, you kind of end up with certain pet causes now also get promoted as human rights. Where, it's because it's so much about the individual, how dare you put any restraint on it? So we can't say anything about marriage or family or sexual behavior, which I'll talk about in the next one. And you end up with kind of promoting these things in all sorts of fora, including the UN, with the result that you actually legitimize the claims of other countries when they say, well, you're just ideologically colonizing us, right? That's a legitimate complaint. But who gets to use that complaint? Well, the actual human rights abusers, right? So even though they are actually violating human rights, it becomes very difficult to actually challenge them because it's so easy to dismiss the whole thing as kind of a Western imperialist cultural project. Okay? Those special interest groups, they include NGOs. I would say they include UN entities, having spent a lot of time with UNAIDS lately, in particular, and they have significant influence in some countries. So I remember I went a few years ago to like the UN, like the CSW, Commission on the Status of Women briefing at the US mission here. And here's all of our NGO representatives. This was like 2015, 2016. And here's like the 5 people from Planned Parenthood and the Trevor Project and all of these like very contentious issues are on our official CSW delegation, right? So there's significant influence there as well. The next part is creep, and by creep I mean like the plants that, just to make sure we're on the same page here, the plants that like grow up the walls, right? The creeping ivies, they kind of slowly take over and kind of get into places. That's what I'm talking about, not like creepy like a person. So we've got. I'm just going to be patient. let it come up. So the UN is not just a human rights institution, despite what you might hear. It has pillars. So peace and security is one, human rights is one, development is another, and as our nuncio has spotted, justice is arguably the fourth, although they usually only talk about the first 3. But there's a push to make kind of everything about human rights. So, Julia probably talked about this some, but in the development context now she's seeing again and again, oh, but we have to incorporate human rights here. Or even in the HIV document that I've been negotiating, that one, there's a big push to put human rights references everywhere, and that's because the definition of human rights has kind of been co-opted and it's being abused and misused. And so it's a way to kind of push things in, and it makes it very challenging because who wants to say we're against human rights? Nobody wants to say they're against human rights, but the complaint is, well, this is really about development. This should be more balanced. And so this comes up in a rights-based approach. We've got I'm going to wait. Okay, it let me click it this time to wait. And well, I'll just keep talking. So that gives you kind of what I've already addressed, the attempted redefinition of development in that sense. So basically, and I'm sure Julia mentioned this, right? Everything now, it's all about climate and gender, right? Gender equality, it's really more on the human rights side of things, but don't really care. So for us, it's okay. I don't have too much left on this one anyway. For us, for our role, like first of all, we have to assert, what's a proper understanding of the human person, okay? What's needed for human flourishing? You do need freedom from some restraints, right? Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, these are all really important. But you can't just say, well, hey, starving person who can't get a job with just working conditions, you can go talk about that in the town square. That's fine, you're set now, right? So we have to understand, what's important for human flourishing there. Then the next part is we have to oppose problematic policies, terminology, attempts to kind of prioritize kind of this individualistic approach, or also the reduction of human beings to group identities. Oh, look at that. Thank you. You're a miracle worker. This is really just me getting a little ahead of myself. It's PowerPoint. And then, of course, we want to be a voice for the weak, the vulnerable, and the voiceless. We want to be defending them, okay? So sometimes people like us when we're there, but a lot of times they're not really happy with us. So there's a lot of kind of pressure to try to shift our position, weaken our opposition. This is like my war story time on that one, where I was at an NGO that has UN accreditation before, so I've met some people and tried to influence things from the outside. And then it became clear, the new Holy See person is someone that one of the people in the EU's team for the Commission status of women knows. Oh, she's so excited. It would be so nice if you, aren't aligning with countries that we just don't, it doesn't make any sense that you would line up with those countries, because like, of course, the Middle Eastern countries tend to be more socially conservative. And in CSW, we have a lot of debate about abortion, although nobody will say it directly. So, it would, don't come in all the time. You don't need to come in on every issue, literally. Then the other thing is just to kind of exclude or limit our participation. And that came up during those negotiations, which was interesting, where members from that EU negotiating team essentially said things like, well, since no member state has objected, why don't we just accept this as it is? Or not inviting us to kind of the smaller group discussions that sometimes happen. We're lucky sometimes we get in, but sometimes we don't. Now, on the other hand, we do have some influence. The guy sitting at the back there, Mr. Roger Landry, did a big presentation with Laudato Si right during the SDG negotiations and discussions, and it really did take the UN kind of by storm. I mean, I went into other meetings and was hearing from one of the chairs of those negotiations about how wonderful and helpful it was. So that's really great. The Global Compact on Migration, we set out the Holy See set out like a series of talking points that seemed to basically become the foundation for a lot of the discussions that followed, right? So that's really great. I think the COVID Commission has had some influence. That's under the Dicastery for Integral Human Development. Certainly, it's a great moral voice and kind of calling for more access, particularly for vaccines and for care in the developing world. And then just in the negotiations, so for like every delegation that we're annoying and pissing off, we also have kind of a rallying effect. So, I mean, this works both ways. I really think that like the guy from Uruguay is just listening for me to talk so he can say the opposite of everything I said right now. But on the other hand, I know that like when I bring something up, there are countries that, maybe they're stretched a little bit thin and they're kind of listening for stuff that they didn't have the time to check or to research or to figure it out, and they'll kind of come in and support that in that way. So, went slightly long, perhaps due to I'm just going to blame the tech, even though it was probably my fault. Any questions on that as we kind of look at it? No. All right. I'll keep revising this. We'll see how it goes.
Would you say most of your work is sort of damage limitation then, because sort of the two ideas are so far apart now?
There is definitely an aspect of damage limitation. We do try to get good things in. Sometimes it's easier than others. We did get some like good language related to poverty, and I think it's going to be in this HIV document. But the opposition is kind of weird on some things. Yeah, I have some of the, like Johanna was like, it was a weird experience the other day. Like countries who don't usually agree with us on anything, in the tech context, we seem to be on the same page. So, sometimes it is really about advancing that kind of the positive ideas, but there is a huge element of damage limitation. Yeah, absolutely.
How do you sort of breach the divide? Because it seems like a lot of the time, so from our point of view, obviously we're afforded human rights because it's God-given or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
When like lots of things like LGBTQ or whatever most of it's sort of who shouts the loudest or who has the
Yeah.
most money? How do you sort of get across that, or is it just not really possible?
It's tough, and it's also tough because there's a lot of pressure on developing countries in the aid context. So, and even like I've heard now from 3 or 4 countries that UNAIDS has been reaching out to their capitals, not necessarily in a way to like direct pressure, but saying like, oh, we would love if your president comes to this high level event and speaks, or, you know, not comes to COVID times, but that kind of puts pressure that if they have this high level participation and the document is voted on rather than adopted by consensus, or I don't think it's going to fail, I think we're going to get stuck with a bad document, but if it actually failed, then this is now a huge embarrassment that for this person to have been involved in. So it creates additional pressure for them to basically give up on their opposition to some of these things. And we know that similar things happen from individual countries or from groups of countries with the Commission on the Status of Women, where opposition, like there are groups that should generally be more on our side, like the African group or the Caribbean community. They're generally much more aligned with us on issues related to life, family, sexuality, but they don't have internal unity. Some of these countries are true believers in terrible ideas. South Africa. Yeah, but most of them, right? Most countries in Africa would be aligned with us, except for the dependence on donor aid. So that it's definitely a real problem there. Yeah.
And has had the policy any like intervention or something in the increasing of financing programs? Like sometimes we hear that the problem is that there is like underfinancing for some programs, and has.
Yeah, so for us, we, at least in our sector, we take kind of a step back on the official development assistance stuff. There's always arguments over it. That is a big argument in the HIV declaration, actually. We had like 5 small meetings yesterday, and 4 of them were on exactly the sort of things that you would expect, like reproductive rights, sexual orientation, gender identity, you know, those sorts of issues. And then like one of them was only on like intellectual property rules and stuff related to sharing generic HIV medicines. We tend to stay out of that because we're not, obviously the Catholic Church provides a huge amount of services. I think we're estimated at about 25% of all HIV care in the world is provided by Catholic institutions, is the estimate. But we're not like writing countries checks for the most part. You know, there are some grants that may happen, but it's just not at the level of official development assistance. So we tend to stay out of those discussions.
That doesn't really afford the Holy See sort of any extra influence then.
It's tough, you know, but I think, you know, we kind of stay out of the way. And I think that also is kind of appreciated. We're not putting up a barrier to those requests. And in other contexts, like in mine, the only thing I'm coming across is really official development assistance, ODA. But in Julia's context, we actually do a lot to really promote development, including development assistance. So that's just not my area, but there are other areas where we align very closely with the developing world. And I mean, Julia has all sorts of stories of how well appreciated and the influence that we have on them, even to the point where she was pretty much ignored and excluded from something and was giving, but just all of her points just got made by kind of the collective of developing countries.
Yeah, everybody, we're going to take a few-minute break, switch some apparatuses, and Nadia's got a second presentation coming on.
So if you don't like me, it'll be done soon.
After the 3-minute break. Jeremy, I'm going to ask you to come out and come back in because we're going to be switching computers.
Okay.
Is your cold on? Almost?
It's getting better, but it's not.
It's hard to tell because you kind of keep your voice on the gravelly side in general.
Sorry.
Gravelly.
Right, but in a practical sense, that's not a huge difference.